Abandoned in childhood, he becomes rich and finds his parents living on the streets. Michael Anderson stopped the Lexus at the traffic light on Fifth Avenue when he saw something that made his heart race. His eyes locked onto an elderly woman reaching her hand through car windows, begging for change. It wasn't the situation that shocked him. He was used to seeing people in need on the streets of New York City. It was when she lifted her face to thank someone for a coin they'd given her that Michael felt the world stop. There, on the neck of that gray-haired woman in tattered clothes, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark, exactly like his. "It can't be," he murmured to himself, hands trembling on the steering wheel. 35 years had passed since he'd been left at the door of St. Mary's home in Boston, just 5 years old. All he had from that time was a vague memory of a woman crying and a promise that they'd come back for him. The same mark he saw in the mirror every day since childhood was right there, on the woman begging for change. The light turned green, and cars behind him began honking, but Michael couldn't move. He watched the woman walk away with an elderly man carrying a bag of cans. The couple moved slowly, her leaning on his arm, both bent by the weight of years and hardship. Without a second thought, Michael parked the car in a nearby spot and got out. His Brooks Brothers suit contrasted with the street surroundings, but he didn't care. He walked in the direction where he'd seen the couple disappear, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone around could hear it. He found them sitting on a park bench, sharing a piece of bread someone had given them. The woman chewed slowly, as if trying to make the small meal last. The man beside her had completely white hair and calloused hands, the kind that came from a lifetime of labor. Michael approached hesitantly. How do you address two people who might be your parents without shocking them? How do you ask about a past they might not even want to remember? "Excuse me," he said, his voice rougher than usual. The couple looked up. The woman smiled kindly despite the exhaustion on her face. The man studied him with suspicion, as if expecting to be told to leave. "Would you two like to have lunch?" Michael asked, trying to sound casual. "There's a diner right on the corner. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. No need to trouble yourself, son," the woman replied, using son affectionately, as many from her generation did. "We've already eaten today." That simple word hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Son. How many times had he dreamed of hearing that from a real mother? "I insist," he said, trying to keep his composure. "It's no trouble at all." The elderly man studied Michael for a few seconds before nodding slowly. "All right, young man. Eleanor hasn't eaten properly in 2 days. We just don't want to be a bother." Eleanor? The name echoed in Michael's mind like a distant bell. There was something familiar about it, a melody his memory strained to grasp. The three of them walked to the diner. Michael ordered 2 full meals, watching the couple's gestures closely. The way Eleanor held her fork, how the man who introduced himself as Richard stirred his coffee. Small details that could confirm or shatter his suspicions. "Are you from New York City?" Michael asked, trying to sound interested but not nosy. "No, we came from out of town," Richard replied, eyes downcast. "From Boston. But that was a long time ago." Michael's heart raced. Boston, exactly where the orphanage he grew up in was located. "And what brought you here?" Eleanor and Richard exchanged a meaningful glance. It was the kind of look couples who've spent decades together can share, a silent conversation that needs no words. "We were looking for someone," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "We've been searching for a long time, but we gave up a few years ago." "Someone in the family?" "Our son." Richard took a deep breath. "We lost our boy when he was little. We spent everything we had trying to find him. In the end, we had nothing left." Michael felt his throat tighten. He wanted to ask more, but knew he was treading dangerous ground. If they really were his parents, how would they react knowing the son they'd searched for was right there in front of them? "I'm so sorry for your loss," he managed to say. "We didn't lose him." Eleanor lifted her eyes, and Michael saw fierce determination behind the forming tears. "He's alive. A mother knows these things. We just don't know where." After lunch, Michael offered to take them to where they were staying. He found out they slept under an overpass on the east side, alongside others in similar situations. The place was makeshift with cardboard and tarps forming small shelters. "Thank you for the meal, young man," Richard said, extending his hand. "You have a good heart." When Michael shook the older man's hand, he felt calluses in exactly the same places he had his own. Calluses from a lifetime of holding tools, from working with his hands. Another coincidence that might not be a coincidence at all. That night, Michael couldn't sleep in his penthouse on the Upper East Side. He stared out the window at the city lights, thinking about the couple beneath the overpass. For the first time in years, childhood memories rushed back in full force. He remembered a woman singing softly to lull him to sleep, rough hands gently stroking his hair, a man teaching him how to fly a kite in the backyard of a modest home. Fragments of memories he'd always assumed were dreams or the inventions of a lonely child. The next morning, Michael returned to the overpass with breakfast for everyone living there. He didn't want to seem like he was giving Eleanor and Richard special attention, but he needed to be near them, to observe, to understand. "You came back," Eleanor smiled when she saw him. "You didn't have to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," Michael handed out bread and hot coffee. "I like to help when I can." Over the following days, he established a routine. He stopped by every morning before work and every evening after leaving the office. He always brought food, sometimes clothes or blankets. Slowly, he earned the couple's trust and listened to their stories. Richard had been a mechanic his whole life. Eleanor, a seamstress. They lived simply but had owned a home in Boston and a son who was the joy of their lives. Everything changed when the boy disappeared. "How did you lose him?" Michael asked one evening, trying to keep his voice steady. "It was a social worker." Richard clenched his fists, the anger still raw after all these years. "She said we'd lose custody of Michael because we couldn't raise him properly, that it was better to give him to a family who could offer him a better life." Michael, that was his name. The name he'd always known was his, but now it carried an entirely different weight, coming from that man's lips. "The woman said it would only be temporary," Eleanor continued, tears starting to fall. "That once our situation improved, he'd come back. But when we went to get Michael a few months later, they said he'd been adopted and sent far away, that we couldn't see him anymore. We never stopped looking." Richard shook his head. "We spent all our savings on detectives, on lawyers. We sold the house, sold everything, and we never heard anything again." Michael felt the world spin around him. The story matched perfectly with what he knew about his own childhood. The age, the location, the details. It couldn't be a coincidence. "What was the boy like?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "He looked just like me when I was young." Richard smiled through his tears. "Same dark hair, same eyes, and he had a little mark right here on his neck." He touched his own neck in the exact spot where Michael had his birthmark, just like his mother's. It was too much. Michael had to step away, pretending to get more coffee, but really just trying to breathe and hold back the tears threatening to spill. There it was, the confirmation he needed. They were his parents. The parents who had spent 30 years searching for him were living on the streets while he slept in a $3 million penthouse. Guilt and anger swirled inside him. Guilt for having a comfortable life while they suffered. Anger for the lost years, for the nights he cried missing a family he had, but was taken from him by cruel bureaucracy. When he returned with the coffee, he found Eleanor tending to a small child whose parents also lived there. She was humming softly the same song he vaguely remembered from his childhood, the same melody he sometimes found himself singing without knowing why. "You're good with children," Michael remarked. "I've had practice," she smiled sadly. My Michael was such a sweet boy. Smart, always asking questions about everything. He wanted to know how things worked, how cars moved, why the sky was blue. Michael remembered himself as a child, always curious, always asking the orphanage staff about everything he saw. Even though he was very young when he was separated from his parents, some traits had stayed with him. "I'm sure he grew up to be a good man," Michael said, testing the waters. "I have faith in that," Eleanor replied. "I always imagined him grown up, maybe married with children, maybe even well off, who knows, maybe he went to school, graduated. He was a clever boy." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. With every conversation, Michael uncovered more details that confirmed his suspicions. The way Richard folded napkins, exactly as Michael did without thinking. How Eleanor seasoned food, preferring salt over sugar. Little habits a child picks up from their parents and carries for life. But something still bothered him. Why had they agreed to give up their son? No matter how tough things were, it seemed strange that loving parents would simply go along with it. "Tell me more about when you gave Michael up," he asked one night, careful not to sound intrusive. Richard and Eleanor exchanged another glance. There was something they weren't saying. "The truth is, we didn't give him up willingly," Richard finally admitted. "The social worker said if we didn't agree, they'd take him by force, and we'd never be allowed to visit. At least by handing him over, she promised it would be temporary." "We were really struggling," Eleanor added. "I'd lost my job at the factory. Richard was sick and couldn't work properly. We couldn't afford food every day. We thought it was best for Michael. But they promised it was only until things got better." Richard clenched his fist on his knee. "They lied to us. When we came back 6 months later, with new jobs and a little money saved, they said the boy was already gone, that he'd been adopted by a wealthy family who could give him everything we couldn't." Michael felt a mix of understanding and pain. His parents hadn't abandoned him because they didn't love him. They did what they thought was best, even if they were deceived in the process. The anger he had carried for years began to transform into something different. "Did you really believe he was okay?" he asked. "It's what kept us going," Eleanor replied. "Thinking our boy was in a good home with people who could give him an education, food every day, new clothes. It even hurt to imagine him calling another woman Mom, but if he was happy, it was worth it." That night, Michael made a decision. He couldn't keep pretending to be just a benefactor. He needed to do something for his parents without revealing who he was yet. First, he wanted to understand the full story better and prepare for the hardest conversation of his life. He quietly hired a private investigator to look into the social worker and the orphanage. What he discovered left him even more furious. Patricia Sullivan, the social worker responsible for his case, had been part of an illegal adoption scheme that operated for years. Wealthy families paid large sums to adopt children quickly, without red tape. She falsified documents, fabricated stories about birth families, and pocketed a significant portion of the money. Michael had never been legally adopted. His paperwork was entirely forged to make it seem like he'd been abandoned by unknown parents. Patricia had claimed his parents disappeared, which was why he grew up in the orphanage instead of being placed for immediate adoption. The investigator managed to locate Patricia, now 80 years old, living comfortably in a luxury condo in Boston. She had retired from public service with a hefty pension and still lived off investments made with the money from illegal adoptions. Michael decided to confront her. He found her watering plants on her apartment balcony, an elegant, well-put-together woman who showed no remorse for her crimes. "Patricia Sullivan?" Michael called. "Yes, who are you?" "Michael Anderson. I think you remember me." Patricia studied him for a few seconds, then paled. Even after all these years, she recognized the boy she had taken from his parents. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, but her voice trembled. "I have documents here that prove everything," Michael said, holding up a folder the investigator had prepared. "I know exactly what you did to me and so many other children." Patricia dropped the watering can, water spilling across the balcony floor. "What do you want from me?" "The truth. All of it." Pressed by the evidence, Patricia finally confessed. She admitted Michael should never have been separated from his parents, that she had lied about his family's situation and forged documents so he couldn't be found. "Why did you do it?" Michael asked, struggling to control his anger. "Easy money," she admitted without remorse. "Wealthy families wanted children fast, no questions asked. I made it happen." "And the real families? Their problem. If they couldn't afford to raise their kids properly, they were better off with those who could." Michael wanted to scream, to make this woman pay for all the years of suffering she had caused. But he knew it wouldn't bring back the lost time or ease his parents' pain. "My parents spent 30 years looking for me," he said, his voice controlled but icy. "They lost everything trying to find me. They're living on the streets because of you." "Not my fault if they couldn't get their lives together," Patricia replied, her voice as cold as ever. Michael left angrier than before. Patricia would keep living comfortably while her victims suffered. There was no justice in that, but at least now he had absolute certainty about his past. That night, he returned to the overpass, determined to help his parents but still without the courage to reveal the truth. How do you tell two people that the son they had searched for over 3 decades was right there, standing before them, for weeks? "The young man seems different today," Eleanor observed. "Did something happen?" Michael realized he couldn't hide his emotions as he once could. The discovery about Patricia, the confirmation of the entire story, was written all over his face. "I've been thinking about you," he said, which wasn't a lie. "About Michael's story. It's hard not to think about him." Richard looked down at his hands. "Not a day goes by that I don't imagine how he might be today, if he got to study, if he has a family, if he's happy." "I'm sure he is." Michael managed to smile for the first time in days. "And I'm sure he'd understand why you did what you did." "Do you think so?" Eleanor seemed desperate to believe it. "Sometimes I'm afraid he hates us for letting them take him away." "No child hates their parents for trying to do what's best for them." Michael chose his words carefully. "Even when things go wrong." During that conversation, he decided it was time to change his parents' situation, even if he wasn't quite ready for the full truth. He started slowly, offering more substantial help. "I have a proposal for you," he said a few days later. "I know a place where you can stay. It's not charity. It's in exchange for work." Richard was immediately interested. Even at his age, he still wanted to work, still wanted to keep his dignity. "What kind of work?" "Caretakers for a small building. Nothing too heavy, mostly keeping things clean and receiving mail. There's a little house in the back where you can live." It was a lie. Michael had bought a small building in the city center specifically for this. He had the back house renovated and hired a cleaning company so Richard and Eleanor wouldn't actually have to do hard labor. "We don't really know you." Richard hesitated. "Why would you do this for us?" "Because you remind me of my own parents," Michael replied, which technically wasn't a lie either. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. After much hesitation, Richard and Eleanor accepted the offer. Michael helped them move, buying them new clothes, replacing documents they'd lost over their years on the streets, taking care of every detail. Seeing his parents in a real home, taking hot showers, sleeping in a bed, was both heartwarming and painful. Heartwarming because they were finally safe. Painful because Michael knew he could have given this to them much sooner if he'd had the courage to reveal himself. Their routine changed. Michael visited his parents' house almost every day, always with the excuse of checking if they needed anything for work. In truth, he just wanted to be near them, to somehow make up for lost time. It was during one of these visits that the first real crisis happened. Michael arrived at the house and found no one there. He searched the rooms, called out for them, but got no answer. Just as he was starting to worry, he heard a noise from the bathroom. He found Richard on the floor, unconscious. Eleanor was kneeling beside him, frantic. "I can't wake him up," she sobbed. "He was fine just a minute ago, taking a shower. Then I heard a noise." Michael didn't hesitate. He carried Richard to the car and sped to the nearest hospital. The whole way he held Eleanor's hand as she whispered prayers non-stop. At the hospital, while Richard was being examined, Michael stayed in the waiting room with Eleanor. It was the first time they were truly alone together in a moment of crisis. "I can't lose him," she murmured. "I've already lost my son. I can't lose my husband too." "You won't." Michael held her hand, feeling the rough skin of someone who had worked hard all their life. "He's strong." "You're so good to us." Eleanor looked into his eyes. "Sometimes I feel like we've met before. There's something in the way you look at me." Michael felt his heart race. Was she noticing something? "Maybe it's because we care about each other," he managed to reply. The doctor appeared a few hours later with good news. Richard had had a drop in blood pressure, likely caused by the sudden change in diet and environment. Nothing serious, but he would need to take some precautions. You can go home today, the doctor said. He just needs rest and to keep taking his blood pressure medication. On the way back, Richard was quiet, embarrassed for causing trouble. Sorry about this, young man, he said. I didn't want to be a burden. You're no burden, Michael replied, and for the first time he almost slipped up. A father is never a burden to the people who care about him. Eleanor looked at Michael closely. She had noticed the hesitation, the word that almost came out. That night, Michael decided he couldn't delay any longer. The situation at the hospital had shown him that his parents were aging, that time was too precious to waste. They deserved to know the truth, even if it was hard for everyone. He carefully planned how to tell them. He couldn't just say, "I'm your son." He needed to prepare the ground, let them reach the conclusion themselves, or at least soften the shock. He began by bringing up more childhood memories of Michael as a boy. He asked about the child's habits, the things he liked, the last days before he was taken away. Michael was always curious, Eleanor shared during dinner. He wanted to know everything, and he had this funny habit of folding his napkins the same way every time he finished eating. Michael looked at his own napkin, folded exactly as she had described, a very specific way he had always done it without thinking. What do you mean? Let me show you. Eleanor took her napkin and folded it into a triangle, then folded it again into a small square. He always did it like this, said it was neater. It was exactly how Michael folded his napkins, every time, without fail. That's funny, Michael remarked, trying to keep his voice casual. I have that same habit. Richard looked up at him, an odd expression on his face. You really do, he said slowly. I've noticed it a few times. Thought it was a coincidence. Must be, Michael shrugged, but he could feel the tension rising in the room. Over the next few weeks, Michael dropped more obvious hints. He mentioned growing up in an orphanage in Boston, that he didn't know his birth parents, that he had a birthmark on his neck. With each new detail, he saw Richard and Eleanor's eyes grow more attentive, more hopeful, but also more afraid. It was as if they desperately wanted to believe, but were terrified of being disappointed again. The moment of truth came unexpectedly. Michael was helping Richard fix a faucet when the older man stopped mid-task and stared at him. Can I ask you a personal question? Of course. How old are you? 35. Richard dropped the wrench. He did the math quickly in his head. And you were born when? Michael gave the exact date. Richard paled. Michael? The question came out as a whisper, heavy with 3 decades of hope and pain. Michael couldn't speak. He just nodded slowly, tears beginning to stream down his face. Richard rose slowly, as if in a dream. He reached out and gently touched the birthmark on Michael's neck. My boy, he whispered. My boy has come back. That's when Eleanor appeared in the kitchen and saw the 2 men embracing and crying. It took her a few seconds to understand what was happening, but when she did, her legs gave way and she had to lean against the wall. Michael, she repeated the name, as if testing whether it was real. Hi, Mom, Michael managed to say through his tears. The 3 of them held each other for long minutes, crying together for 30 years of longing, pain, and separation. There were no words to describe that moment. It was the healing of wounds that had never fully closed. When they finally pulled apart, the questions they had all held onto for so many years began. How did you find us? Eleanor asked. I saw your birthmark at the traffic light, just like mine. And you didn't say anything from the first day? I needed to be sure, and I needed to prepare myself for this moment. Richard shook his head, still in disbelief. So many times we passed right by each other all these years and never knew. What was your life like? Eleanor touched her son's face, as if memorizing every detail. Were you happy? Michael hesitated. How could he explain the loneliness, the nights crying at the orphanage, the constant feeling that something was missing? I had opportunities, he said. I studied, built a career. But I always felt there was an emptiness. And now? Richard asked. How do you feel? Whole, Michael smiled through his tears. For the first time in my life, I feel whole. They talked all night. Michael told them about his life at St. Mary's Home, how he got a scholarship for college, how he built his business. Richard and Eleanor shared the years they spent searching for him, how they never stopped believing he was alive. "I always knew you were okay," Eleanor said. "A mother feels these things, but imagining and knowing are different." "You know I have money now," Michael eventually said. "I can give you anything you want, a big house, trips, anything." Richard and Eleanor exchanged glances. "We don't want your wealth, son," Richard said. "We want you. We want time together. We want to be a family." "That's worth more than any money," Eleanor agreed. Michael realized they were right. For years, he had piled up wealth trying to fill a void that could only be filled by love and family. In the months that followed, they rebuilt their relationship slowly. Michael moved his parents to a bigger, more comfortable house, but he didn't go overboard with luxury. They wanted simplicity, the feeling of a normal family that had been broken so many years ago. They started new traditions, Sunday dinners where Eleanor taught Michael the recipes she used to make when he was little, walks in the park where Richard showed him how to fly a kite again. Small moments that were both new and familiar. "Remember when you were little and helped me in the workshop?" Richard asked during one of those walks. "Bits and pieces," Michael smiled. "You let me hold the small tools. You always said you'd be an engineer when you grew up, wanted to build flying cars. Ended up a businessman. Don't build flying cars, but it's not bad." Richard laughed, a sound Michael had forgotten existed. Not bad at all. There were hard moments too, conversations about the lost years, the missed chances, the anger they all felt at the injustice of what had happened. "Sometimes I think about what life would have been like if they'd never taken you," Eleanor said during one of those talks. "Maybe you wouldn't be a businessman, maybe you wouldn't have studied so much, but we'd be together," Michael finished, "and that would have made it all worth it." "We can't change the past," Richard said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, "but we have the present, and that's already more than I ever hoped to have." Michael realized his parents had aged with a wisdom he was still learning. They understood that life was rarely fair, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth living. They had lost decades with their son, but they hadn't lost their ability to love, to forgive, to start over. A year after their reunion, Michael organized a small gathering to celebrate Eleanor's birthday. Nothing too fancy, just a few neighbors, simple food, soft music. The kind of celebration his mother truly enjoyed. During the party, he watched Eleanor interact with people, laughing, telling stories about the son she had found again. She radiated a happiness that had nothing to do with money or social status. It was the simple joy of a mother who had her child back. Richard, in turn, had become something of a mentor to Michael in business. His decades of experience as a mechanic gave him a practical understanding of how things worked, perfectly complementing Michael's theoretical training. "You think like a businessman," Richard said during one of their work conversations. "I think like someone who gets his hands dirty. Together we make a good team." It was true. Michael had started including his father in some company decisions, especially those related to operations. Richard's practical perspective often pointed out problems Michael didn't see from his office. On one such occasion, Richard suggested the company create an internship program for kids from orphanages. Michael not only approved the idea, but made it one of the company's priorities. "We know what it's like to grow up without family," Richard explained. "Maybe we can help other boys and girls who've gone through what you did." The program was a success. Michael got personally involved, meeting each young intern, tracking their progress, offering not just job opportunities, but also a kind of temporary family. "You're doing what I always wanted to do," Eleanor said, watching Michael talk with one of the interns. "Taking care of other children as if they were your own." "I learned from you," Michael smiled. "Even from a distance, you taught me what it means to love a child unconditionally." 2 years after their reunion, Michael made a decision he'd been considering for months. He significantly scaled back his work responsibilities, delegating more to his team so he could spend more time with his parents. "You don't have to give up your work for us," Richard said when Michael told them. "I'm not giving it up," Michael explained. "I'm choosing what's more important. You're both 70. I'm 37. Our time together is limited and precious. But you worked so hard to build this company, and I'll keep working. I just won't let work be more important than family anymore." It was a lesson Michael had learned the hard way. For years, he'd chased wealth and success, trying to fill a void only family could fill. Now that he had his family back, he wasn't going to make the mistake of neglecting them again. The three settled into a routine that worked for everyone. Mornings at the office, afternoons with family, weekends completely dedicated to being together, simple trips to places Richard and Eleanor wanted to visit. "I've never been to the beach," Eleanor admitted during one of their travel talks. "Then we'll go to the beach," Michael said immediately. "We don't need an expensive hotel or anything like that," Richard quickly added. "We won't go to an expensive hotel. Let's rent a simple little beach house and spend a week together, like a normal family." And that's what they did. Michael, who was used to first-class trips and five-star hotels, discovered that some of the best memories of his life were made in a simple little house in Cape Cod, eating grilled fish and watching Eleanor dip her feet in the ocean for the first time. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said, gazing at the endless horizon. "And more beautiful," Richard added. Michael watched them discover the sea like children and realized he was living a moment no amount of money could buy. During that trip, Richard had a serious talk with Michael about the future. "Your mother and I won't live forever," he said as they walked along the beach. "Don't talk like that, Dad. I have to. I want you to know, these 2 years with you have been the best of my life. Even with all the pain of the years apart, it was worth it for these moments. For me too. When I'm gone, I want you to take care of your mother. She's strong, but she'll need you." "I'll always take care of her," Michael promised. "And you'll be with us for many more years." "I hope so. But if not, I want you to know I'll die happy. I found my son, saw he became a good man, and got the chance to be his father again. That's more than any man has the right to ask for." That conversation left a deep mark on Michael. It made him cherish every moment with his parents even more, every talk, every meal together. In the 3rd year after their reunion, Richard's health began to decline. Nothing serious, just the natural wear of age and the hard years he'd lived. Michael hired the best doctors, but knew it wasn't a matter of money, it was a matter of time. "Don't blame yourself for this," Eleanor said, seeing her son's worry. "He's happy, we both are. We got to be a family again before it was too late. Sometimes I think about the time we lost. And I think about the time we gained. 3 years with you were worth 30 years of longing." Michael understood she was right. There was no use dwelling on the past. What mattered was making the most of the present they had together. He arranged the house to make Richard more comfortable. He brought in medical equipment, hired nurses, did everything in his power. But what really mattered to Richard was having his family close. "Tell me about your work," Richard would ask on days when he was weaker. Michael talked about company projects, the interns in the program they'd created, plans for the future. Richard listened carefully, offering suggestions, staying involved in decisions even from a distance. "I'm proud of you," he said during one of those talks. "Not just for your success, but for the man you've become." "I learned from you," Michael held his father's hand. "Even when you weren't there, you taught me about dignity, honest work, and love." "How so?" "Because when I found out the truth about why we were separated, I understood the kind of people you and Mom are. You chose to suffer rather than see your son go without. That taught me more about character than any lesson could." Richard smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. "Then it was worth it. All the pain was worth it." During those months, Michael spent most of his time at home, working only when necessary. His priority was being present, making memories, somehow making up for the lost years. One night, when Richard was struggling to sleep, Michael sat by his bed and softly sang a song he faintly remembered from childhood. "You remember this song?" Richard asked, surprised. "I remember someone singing it to me when I was little. Was it you?" "It was. I sang it every night until you fell asleep." Michael kept singing, and for the first time in decades, Richard slept peacefully. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you believe Michael made the right choices throughout the story? We'd love to read your opinion, and thank you so much for your company.